The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr.
James
Speaker.
Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we've had 8 years of Mr. Joyce speaking to his own backbenchers rather than the country. We've had 8 years of crowing and self-congratulation rather than talking about how this government plans to solve the great challenges of our time. And seeing as she raised it in her response to my questions earlier in question time today, let's talk a little bit about the population of New Zealand. So in 1973, when I was born, the population of New Zealand was just shy of 3 million people. Today, 43 years later, it stands at a little over 4.5 million. In other words, we have added half again to our population in the time that I've been alive. By the time that I die, and there are some benign assumptions in this equation, by the time that I die, our population will have doubled. In other words, we have gone from being a country where we could pretty much carry on as we liked. We could pretty much take whatever we wanted from our forests and our rivers and our aquifers and our seas, confidently believing that they would replenish themselves naturally. We could dump our waste into the atmosphere, into our rivers, into our oceans and into our land with little visible consequence. And today we have a government that carries on as if that was somehow still true, as if it ever was true. It stopped being true some time ago. Mr. Speaker, for 8 years now, we have had a government that has actively invested public money in the pollution of our rivers, our aquifers and our oceans. For 8 years now, we've had a government that would rather run a budget surplus than save our endangered birds. For 8 years, we've had a government that believes that stopping climate change will be more expensive than living with deeper droughts, worse storms and rising seas. And tomorrow, just as Mr. Joyce did now, the government will sit and crow as they deliver their second to last budget. There will be the usual smattering, I guess, of headline-grabbing announcements designed to make it look as if they're doing something whilst doing absolutely nothing at all. As little as possible, rather than everything possible, in order to save the actual challenges that face us today. Mr. Speaker, when I said that we had a government that's put public money into the pollution of our rivers and our aquifers and our oceans, I'm speaking of their active involvement in converting New Zealand farmland over to intensive dairying, which has led to a situation where 2/3 of our rivers are now unswimmable without the risk of catching some horrible disease. And I expect that in tomorrow's budget, the government will crow, as Mr. Joyce has just done, about some minor clean-up program, but that in another year, our rivers will be just as polluted as they are today, if not more so. When I say that we've got a government that would rather deliver a budget surplus than save endangered birds, I'm speaking of their consistent underfunding of the Department of Conservation for the last 8 years. Every year of National's tenure, government funding for DOC through vote education has been, on average, $55 million less than the last Labor government's. That is $336 million that DOC has had to manage without for the last 8 years. As a result, 142 species have had their threat status increased towards extinction over the last 8 years of this government's watch. DOC huts, bridges and tracks are in disrepair, and I expect that in tomorrow's budget there will be another gimmick designed to make it look like they're doing something about it, but in another year's time our endangered birds will be just at risk of extinction as they are today. And when I say that we've had a government that believes stopping climate change is more expensive than letting it happen, I'm talking about the fact that New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions are 19% higher since this government came to office, since we put in place an emissions trading scheme, the purpose of which is to reduce our emissions. Every year, the news carries stories of record storms, floods, fires and droughts. The 2013 storm, the worst in 60 years, left 30,000 Wellington houses without power, $31 million of insurance claims. The same year's drought wiped $1.5 billion off our economy. Last year, catastrophic flooding in Whanganui and South Dunedin This year, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment mapped out tens of thousands of properties at risk from rising seas over the coming decades. Mr. Speaker, in tomorrow's budget, I expect yet more platitudes from a government that wants to be seen to be doing something whilst at the same time continuing its polluting industries. After 8 years of brighter future, we have declining water quality, more at-risk endangered species and more greenhouse gas emissions. Mr. Speaker, change is coming.